There's a famous first comment on Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, by Rashi, the most famous of the medieval rabbinic commentators, which is really relaying a statement from a Talmudic era sage, Rabbi Yitzchak, about why it is that we even need Sefer Bereshit. Because the question is asked, if it's the case that the Torah is really, in some sense, an instruction manual for Ovdei Hashem, like people who want to serve Hashem and be his servants, that what we really need and in the Torah seemingly is mitzvot, is commandments. So if that's the case, then why wouldn't it be that the Torah would just start with the first mitzvah over in Sefer Shmot? The first mitzvah explicitly given to Bnei Yisrael in Sefer Shmot, in the book of Exodus, is the setting of the month by the moon, which is introduced at the time where they're going to have to perform the Paschal sacrifice for the first time. And so it's about Pesach, it's about the holidays, but it's therefore about the calendar and about the months. And so the first mitzvah is the setting of the month. And that, at the time, when you first encounter this comment by Rashi or by Rabbi Yitzchak, it seems a little arbitrary. The point is, whatever the first mitzvah is, why don't we start there? But as is often the case with the Torah, there's something much less arbitrary going on here, because you might also wonder, why is the setting of the month the first mitzvah in the Torah of all the different things that could appear first? And you might have thought there are plenty of other ones that, if you were considering what might get top billing because it somehow summarizes the whole Torah, or is the essence of morality, or whatever else the Torah is trying to convey, maybe you would have put "don't murder" first or something like that. But we have the setting of the month. So why the setting of the month? This connects, as it turns out, to the structure of the opening passage of Sefer Bereshit, the 7 days of creation. So we've discussed this before in more detail, but I can lay it out in rapid fire. The first 3 days are just about scenery, right? They're just about the stage on which the performance is going to be carried out. There's light and dark, there's upper waters and lower waters, there's land and even plants on the dry land and separating land from sea. But all of that is just kind of the background, the setting for the events. And the last 3 days of the 7 days of creation are the actors who are going to be on the stage. So there's the fish in the sea and the beasts on the land and the birds in the sky, right? The list of all the different animals and mention of the human animal or the human being, which is, human beings as one kind of animal that has a very special and particular ability, which is to acknowledge his creator. And so the seventh day, Shabbat, really stands for the particular qualities of the human being that enable acknowledgement of the creator of the world and how he rested. And so since it will become Shabbat, right, it'll become the Sabbath. So the last 3 days all represent the animal actors, including human beings, and the specialness and distinctiveness of humankind, summarized in Shabbat in the last day, because it becomes about relationship with Hashem. So that's first 3 days stage, last 3 days actors. And then there's the fourth day, which is the central day now, 3 on either side. And then in the center is the fourth day out of 7. And that central day is the sun and the moon and the heavenly bodies, the stars, right? So it's about the setting of the month, because it's about how you're going to mark your mu'adim, as the Torah puts it, your convocations, your special times of year, using the sun and the moon. So it doesn't just mention the sun and the moon, but it says that they're there for keeping time. And the keeping of time is mentioned in specifically with respect to mu'adim, mu'adim meaning special times in the calendar. So it's about the sun and the moon, and it's about their role in the setting of the calendar. So really, the first mitzvah in the Torah is appearing with central billing in the 7 days of creation itself. And so it's not so accidental, in fact, that the setting of the moon is the first mitzvah, because it really ties to, in some sense, an even more fundamental or cosmic centrality of the sun and the moon and the calendar that's being showcased right up in the beginning of Sefer Bereshit. And now we have to ask ourselves why that is. What's so important about that? At one level, you could say, well, maybe it's kind of just a statement about how the Torah understands something about the nature of the universe, right? Like 6 plus 1 is how you would break down the directions of space and time, in fact, right? So normally we think of 6 plus 1 makes the 6 days of creative work and then the seventh day of Shabbat. And interestingly, 6 is all the different directions you can go in three-dimensional space, right? Forward, backward, up, down, left, right. And then 7 is the one direction in time. You can go forward in time, but you can't go backward in time. So we have a notion of time being associated with that +1 day already, if we think in those terms. And that makes sense even with respect to Shabbat, because Shabbat is a special kadosh, or set aside, special, separate, and different holy day. So it's a kedusha in time. And we therefore already associate time to some degree with Shabbat. And so maybe from that perspective, it already makes sense that we're saying Shabbat is the seventh day. So we think about time with that extra +1. But we get that even more explicitly when we realize that there's also a sense in which the +1 seventh day is really the fourth day. Like the extra day on top of the 6 is, remember, the stage and the actors, 3 against 3, and then you have the day about the sun and the moon and the marking of the calendar and the keeping of time on the fourth day, the central day in the middle. So the question now is, what beyond that understanding of time as being kind of a central concept in creation and being featured in that way, what is it trying to teach us about the world and how we're supposed to serve Hashem and everything else? And I think a remaining simple point that we can make is that there is a unity that's being established through this fourth day between two different kinds of perspectives on what the world is as a created system. Because on the one hand, like we've already said, the sun and the moon are related to this idea of the setting of the month and the Moadim, the calendar. So it's about the first mitzvah, and it's about time as a backbone of our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and our mission to serve him according to the Torah. So from one perspective, the central concept at the middle of creation is mitzvot, right? Commandment. We might have thought the 7 days of creation have nothing to do with mitzvot, but we're wrong, because in fact, once you do this analysis, you realize at the center of the structure is the first mitzvah of the Torah. And so at one level, we're being told, yes, there's birds and fish and land and sea and everything else, and it's all very natural and all very cosmic and doesn't yet have to do with the particular mission of Am Yisrael. But at another level, the keystone of creation is the first mitzvah of the Torah, which is standing for the idea of divine commandment, not just as something that establishes the rules of nature, but also something that establishes the laws that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants humankind to obey, and especially wants Am Yisrael, his people, to obey. But on the other hand, the sun and the moon are also about physics, right? They're also about nature. I would say, even before getting specific into physics, you could say, especially in the ancient world, the heavenly bodies are the most predictable things in the world, right? Everything is a mess down on Earth, and you actually need a lot of industrialization, essentially, in order to produce the regularity that makes it possible to do very careful experiments on the ground. But if you are looking up at the sky, it's a very pristine system that, because of the nature of the physics involved and the kinds of objects that you tend to be looking at, there are metrical, mathematical, regular, highly predictable unchangeable relationships that you can observe. The most basic being that the sun rises and sets every day, right? In a world full of hurricanes and stampeding herds of water buffalo and whatever else, to be able to look to the sky and say, okay, I don't know much, but I know the sun's going to rise and set every day, or I know the moon's over the course of a month going to get bigger and smaller in a way that is counted off and I can actually find to be sort of metrical in comparison to the number of days that pass. That regularity is very precious. And that's probably why, to some degree, for the ancients, the heavens became this emblem of predictability to the point where it became an avodah zarah, an idolatry, right? Astrology, to a great degree, maybe is nonsense, but you can understand how it became an attractive way of thinking to people who lived in a messy pre-medieval world, because the sky was the very predictable thing. And so really saying the stars have foretold your future, it's reaching for the most predictable thing in human experience and saying, look, there is something predictable about the world. Listen to me. I have something to say that can tell you about the future, because certainly the stars themselves and the future of the stars' behavior and the future of the sun and the moon's behavior was predictable, even to the ancients. So it's about predictability. It's about the idea that nature and the observability of nature and the sort of metricality of nature is a thing that you can grab onto, you can make sense of, you can predict it, and maybe eventually, as a result of those predictions, you can gain control over nature, right? You can make an almanac based on the sun and the moon. So it's not just about your holidays, right? It's also about when do you plant and when do you reap, and you can get more food that way. And you can start to anticipate changes in weather patterns, et cetera. So there are going to be things about the world you live in that you gain more control over by realizing what's predictable. And that's the beginning of natural science. And it took a very long time for that to become modern physics and for that to become all the engineering. And now we have cell phones and airplanes and spacecraft, et cetera, right? Lots of different fun, interesting things we can do with that ever deepening and broadening knowledge of the natural world and how to turn it to our purpose. But it all begins at some level with the sun and the moon and the stars, right? The most predictable things, and realizing something here in nature is actually something I can get a handle on by noticing the patterns and figuring out what must be driving them, and then realizing the relationships that imply other consequences. So interestingly, then, the Torah is saying, look, the keystone of creation on the one hand is divine command of mitzvot, right? Of these instructions to people of the Torah. And on the other hand, the same talisman, the same emblem, the sun and the moon, is not just about the setting of the month being the first mitzvah, it's also about natural predictability and even maybe physics to some degree, specifically as being the keystone of creation, which in the present day is not a hard sell to make, right? Everything comes from that which is predictable and even metrizable about the world, and physics is really at the foundation of our understanding of that, right? So there's even a sense to some degree that astronomy was the beginning of modern physics, and it's not so surprising that it was, and that ultimately our understanding of everything that's going on can to some degree be couched in terms of it's the consequence of physical laws. So the same degree to which the sun and the moon are moving around and are moving according to laws that actually are very hard to change or break, maybe the whole world is working according to that principle. That even is being hinted and suggested in this opening of the book of Genesis, of Sefer Bereshit. But the point is that the Torah doesn't want to separate these things, right? So it's nice to say, oh, look, it's winking at us. It's showing us it knows that creation is actually, at some level, all centered around physical law. And that's cool. That's a nice thing to see that the Torah is pushing under your nose. But it would be very troubling from a Torah perspective to see that in isolation from the notion that the point and purpose of creation is for there to be people who can develop a relationship with their creator, right? And that is a central thesis of the Torah and the whole tradition, is that that's really what this is all about. There would be no point to just making a bunch of physics with no people in it and with no relationship with the creator and just having a bunch of billiard balls rolling around in predictable ellipses or whatever. That's not interesting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What he ultimately wants, all of his laws of physics are there in order for there to be people who can have a relationship with him and who can learn to understand what he expects of them and then thereby develop a higher level of knowledge of him that produces a sort of higher quality relationship, so to speak, between him and his most cherished creations. But, he needs to do that, or he wants to do that, let's say, through physics. And at some level, it's all kind of founded on that. And on another level, you couldn't just say, oh yeah, creation is all about physics, full stop. You need it to be the case that the single emblem at the center is both representing the idea, on the one hand, of physical law being the essence of everything. And on the other hand, there's divine command of an ethical nature, of a ritual nature, about development of relationship between Tzelem Elohim, the image of God in man, and God himself as being the purpose of all of this. So because the sun and the moon represent both of these things, and because they appear in this fourth day, the center of the 7 days of creation, we're getting a pretty clear message from the Torah that that's what it's all about, right? It's about a world that operates according to predictable natural laws, but that it does so because of the possibility of moral choice and of ritual choice and of relationship to the divine that all of that implies.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.